Good morning, everyone. Thank you for braving the drizzling rain for the program. We are in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium for History is Lunch. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. A few notes. An exhibit that we're working on for next year, Mississippi Distilled, we're looking forward to, and we are also looking for some help on some artifacts. We are looking for accounts of alcohol production, consumption, or abstinence in Mississippi. Particularly during the Prohibition era. Artifacts and documents related to early alcohol in our state, the temperance movement, prohibition enforcement, and the infamous Jackson Country Club raid will contribute greatly to the stories we can tell through this exhibition. There are fact sheets over there by the sign up. Pick one up, and if you have anything to tell us or tell us about someone else, let us know. And remember, too, that you can always support the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum through annual memberships, which start at just $45 and include free admission and discounts at the museum store. For those looking for family activities, Thursdays in June at 3 p.m. at the Eudora Welty House and Garden, we'll again partner with Lemuria for story time on the side porch, where younger children will have books read to them and then make a craft to take home that is free, and you can contact the Welty House for more information. Finally, I hope that you will join us next week for History's Lunch when Shanette Garrett Scott will present I Am Yet Waitin', Freed Women, and the Vicksburg Freedmen's Bank. Today, though, we are delighted to have with us Scott Bell to discuss his book, The Camel Regiment, A History of the Bloody 43rd Mississippi Volunteer Infantry, CSA, 1862 to 65. Bell is a descendant of a member of the 43rd, Corporal John K. Bell. He is a life member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the recipient of several awards from the organization, including membership in the Bonnie Blue Society for his scholarly research and published literature. Bell is retired from the United States Postal Service. The Camel Regiment is his first book. Help me welcome Scott Bell.
I'm not a high-tech guy, so this is kind of new to me. Good afternoon. It is exciting to be here to present the Camel Regiment 43rd Mississippi program. I appreciate the invitation and hard work of Director Chris Goodwin to make this happen, and also Haley, who works behind the scenes. The History is Lunch series offers many interesting and diversified historical programs presented by outstanding authors and other speakers. I have seen the calendar of past and future events, and it is very impressive. My home is in rural East Texas. I have the countryside, which I love, but it would be nice to also have close access to a great museum and archives such as this. I am a card-carrying member of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Researching my family lineage over 2.5 decades ago, I discovered that my parental great-great-grandfather, John K. Bell, was a Confederate soldier. He enlisted at Mooreville, Mississippi, into the Itawamba Tigers, which would become Company H of the 43rd Mississippi. He was 24 years old, married with children, and worked with his father on the family farm. His service records reveal he was a good soldier. He was promoted to first corporal, always present for duty, and his name appears on the surrender records of the 43rd with the Army of Tennessee at War's End in North Carolina. He was typical of Johnny Reb, honorable, steadfast, faithful, and unheralded. The more I found out about his Confederate service, the more interested I became in his regiment, the 43rd Mississippi. It was soon apparent that the 43rd, one of Mississippi's finest regiments, had little of its history preserved and gathered into a single historical document. The MDAH was established in 1902 and specifically charged with documenting the history of its Confederate soldiers. But even when the MDAH published its monumental military history of Mississippi in 1908, its authors had to admit they could not even furnish a list of companies for the 43rd Miss. So poorly was the regiment documented. The men of the 43rd deserved to be remembered and not forgotten. Writing a book had always been on my bucket list. It occurred to me then that this was it. I would research and write a book about the 43rd. I would like to recognize now the contributions to the Camel Regiment by co-historian and talented researcher Jim Huffman of Picayune, Mississippi. His story was similar to mine. His great-great-grandfather, H.J. Gully, also served in the 43rd. Formed in the spring of 1862, recruited from counties in northeast Mississippi, the 43rd was known as a Camel Regiment, at least until Vicksburg. The regiment received its nickname from its unmistakable mascot, a privately imported African dromedary one-humped camel named Old Douglas. He was not a refugee from the U.S. Camel Corps, stationed at Camp Verde or Camp Green, near San Antonio, Texas. Jefferson Davis, when he was Secretary of War in Washington, D.C., was a main supporter of the U.S. Army camel experiment. African camels were shipped to Indianola, Texas in the mid-1850s with the idea being to test if these ships of the desert could replace horses and mules as pack animals in the arid climate and mountainous peaks in the far west. The U.S. Army camel experiment met with mixed reviews, but it was the bad temperament and exceptionally foul smell of the beast that many of the soldiers could not tolerate. Horses and mules would frighten and stampede when they came in contact with the camels. Camp Verde was abandoned at the outbreak of the war, and the camels were left to fend for themselves. The Confederates, new occupants of the camp, found similar problems with the camels. In spite of their difficult nature, there were reports the camels were used to haul cotton, salt, and mail. The U.S. Camel Corps is an interesting story, but not the story of Old Douglas. Old Douglas was one of a group of camels landed in Mobile, Alabama, when the South underwent a minor camel craze, following on the well-publicized heels of U.S. Secretary Jefferson Davis' Camel Corps experiment. Camels were privately imported to test if these beasts of burden could adapt as plow and pack animals on farms and plantations. Old Douglas was purchased by the Hargrove family of the Trinity Plantation in east central Mississippi. Lieutenant William Hargrove presented Douglas to its founding commander, Colonel William H. Moore, when he, Hargrove, joined the 43rd Mississippi. Old Douglas was not a war horse, but used to carry the colonel's equipment. The colonel later gave the camel to the regimental band to carry its instruments and knapsacks. The 43rd was the only regiment, Federal or Confederate, east of the Mississippi River to use a camel militarily. Old Douglas was a celebrity in his day. Not only was he popular with the 43rd, but also the rest of the Confederate Army. Even the Federals were aware of the rebel camel. For the vast majority of these men, Old Douglas was the only camel they had ever seen alive. Organized on May 15, 1862, the 43rd would become a large regiment composed of 11 companies instead of the usual 10. The regiment was fortunate to be led by excellent field and company officers. On the most part, these officers were educated and from prominent and wealthy families. There were slaveholders, but 3/4 of the men were just poor dirt farmers trying to scratch out a living. On the road to the Battle of Iuka, a tragic incident occurred. The 43rd realized, just as the U.S. Camel Corps had found out, that horses and mules don't mix with camels. The driver of Old Douglas had been instructed to keep the camel in the rear of the regiment out of the way. Just at dark, the regiment moved into a field and Old Douglas was in line of travel before the driver knew it. Keeping the suspense there. And trying to find my place. All right. Old Douglas was in line of travel of the regiment before the driver knew it. It's dusky dark. Amid the confusion, a fine black horse belonging to Adjutant William Sykes broke loose from the fence it was tied to and went charging through the line with a fence rail still attached to its halter. This caused a wild stampede by both men and animals, causing some men to climb trees to get out of the way. Sadly, Private William Morris was crushed to death by the horse. The 43rd, as part of a veteran Missouri brigade, was held in reserve at the Battle of Iuka in September of 1862. They dodged a few cannonballs there, but the regiment would be first tested under combat, or see the elephant, as it was called back then, a few weeks later at the Battle of Corinth. On the second day of the Battle of Corinth, Colonel Moore of the 43rd led the Confederate charge that broke through the Union line. The rebels came on in hand-to-hand fighting, house to house, and through the streets and into the rail crossroads near the landmark two-story Tishomingo Hotel. It was here that Colonel Moore was shot off his horse and mortally wounded. This was the Confederate high tide of the battle. Afterwards, one of the Missouri veterans recalled that the 43rd was marked by bravery, the most daring and devoted. Even though the 43rd lost its colonel and Lieutenant Colonel Richard W. Lee in the battle, they would be replaced by other outstanding officers, Colonel Richard Harrison and Lieutenant Colonel Lum Sykes. Sykes would later refer to the regiment as the Bloody 43rd. Sykes' uniform and other possessions are on display at the Kennesaw Battlefield Museum in Georgia. The original painting, Decision at the Crossroads, which is considered the official painting of the Battle of Corinth, hangs in the Civil War Interpretation Center. It's based on this legendary charge. I own one of the prints, and it is proudly displayed in my home. I have an image of the Decision at the Crossroads painting to pass around. The resolution doesn't do this glorious painting justice. You may or not be able to tell, but Colonel Moore is on horseback with the Van Dorn flag close by. In February 1862, General Earl Van Dorn ordered that all units under his command use this flag as their regimental colors. On the back is an image of the Old Douglas headstone. Coins have been placed on top of the stone as a sign of respect and upkeep. I'll talk more about the headstone shortly. So I'll just pass this around and collect it, later. I can walk around. Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. I can kind of be like Donahue and go out and talk to them. Anyway, this here is the resolution didn't come out right, but it's considered the official painting. If you go to the Battle of Corinth at the Interpretation Center, it hangs above. And have anybody seen the Old Douglas headstone out here? Okay. Have you? Okay. I got a picture of it to pass around now. Also, this is off the computer of the same painting here. It's a little bit better resolution, but it's not in color. Okay. After Corinth, the 43rd licked their wounds with the rest of the Confederate Army at Holly Springs. The 43rd was transferred to General Hebert's brigade, consisting of the 3rd Louisiana and several Mississippi regiments, which included the 38th Mississippi, right, Jeff? Okay. The Union Army forced the rebels back along the Mississippi Railroad towards Vicksburg. Near the end of 1862, the 43rd was rushed to Chickasaw Bayou, close to Vicksburg, but arrived just as the battle was winding down. All that is left for the public to see of this battlefield is a historical marker. Most of it is now underwater or in private hands. The beginning of 1863 found the 43rd stationed at Snyder's Bluff. That's near Chickasaw Bayou. There is a historical marker that refers to the location as Fort Snyder. This was a strategic point needed to shut down the Union Navy on the Yazoo River. River batteries were erected along with a raft of logs held by a strong cable blocking the waterway. Swift currents caused the rafts to continually swerve down, sideways, and back and forth. Details from the 43rd were required to make the unsafe passage across the river for guard duty. Eventually, the raft broke free, and the rebels had to compensate for this by bringing in heavy caliber guns. This was also the first time the regiment came under mortar fire launched by the gunboats over the bluff and into their lines and camps. I hope you all follow all that. Okay, so basically the raft, they had to go across the river, and the raft, it's just wood, and it goes up and down a swift current, back and forth, sideways, and the men would have to cross that. If they fell in, it was bad news. Okay, Lincoln said that Vicksburg was a key to the South. On May 18th, Hebert's brigade hustled into the defenses of Vicksburg with the Yankees nipping at their heels. The brigade was assigned to defend what would become known as the 3rd Louisiana Redan. This V-shaped fort blocked the Jackson Road, which was the main artery or the key to Vicksburg. There was hard fighting along the entire Confederate line, but most of the great Vicksburg lore happened at the 3rd Louisiana Redan. After 2 failed attacks upon Vicksburg, the Union Army would concentrate their efforts at the 3rd Louisiana Redan. To move forward in their zigzag trenches against the rifle fire of the rebels, the Yankees used a frame of an old railroad car piled with cotton. To counter this, the rebels stuffed tow wads of cotton saturated with turpentine oil into the hollow of mini balls and then shot them into the cotton bales atop of the rail car, which burned it up. Okay, I have a prop. Sometimes this goes over and sometimes it don't. But they would get a stick. Okay, the Yankees had a railroad car, they had cotton bales on it, they were moving forward, protecting from the rifle fire. So what the rebels did is they have a mini ball, has a hollow, they'd stuff it here, right, with turpentine oil. Then they would stuff it in. This is a bayonet, but pretend it's a ramrod. And they'd stuff it into the rifle, and then they'd shoot into the cotton bales, which would light it up. Okay. All right, well, Yankee ingenuity, being what it is, sap rollers of water-soaked cane wrapped around cotton bales were constructed that wouldn't burn, and on they came. So they just wrapped it around with cane and wetted it down, on they came. A mine explosion detonated by 2,200 pounds of black powder dug under the 3rd Louisiana Redan blew up 6 miners or sappers of the 43rd Miss who were countermining. The Yanks charged into the breach but were forced back. Coonskin Tower, nearby and on the opposite side of the 3rd Louisiana Redan, was named for the Union officer in charge who donned a coonskin hat. The tower was built from railroad iron and cross ties and overlooked the Confederate trenches. Many Johnny Rebs lost their life from the sniper fire of Coonskin Tower. A veteran of the 43rd said, "The boys would experiment by putting a hat on a stick and letting it slowly show above the works. Quicker than you think, 2 or 3 mini balls would go through it, showing that the Federals were all the time watching for someone to expose themselves." Okay. I have another prop. Okay, so you get your lines here. What they'd do, they'd be down here. They'd stick it up like this, right? Before they could get it down, they'd have two or three mini balls through it. That shows you how deadly and how dangerous it was on the lines. Near the end of the siege of Vicksburg, Old Douglas, the beloved camel of the 43rd, while harmlessly grazing, thought to be out of danger, was shot down by Federal sharpshooters. The rebels took revenge and dropped their commanding officer. It was said that Old Douglas served as camel steaks to the starving men and that he was given a military funeral. So he still served even after death, right? J.W. Cook, the 43rd Mississippi, wrote, "Douglas was a faithful, patient animal, and his service merits record." Later, the Bluecoats carved the skeleton of Old Douglas into rings and sold them as souvenirs. After the camel bones ran out, they used cattle bones and claimed they were from Old Douglas the camel. There was once a time when little was known of Old Douglas. In fact, for many years, the Vicksburg National Military Park denied the camel's very existence. Through the research and persistence of myself and particularly fellow historian Jim Huffman, Old Douglas is now acknowledged, celebrated, and there is even Old Douglas merchandise on sale at the park. Old Douglas has a grave marker placed in the memorial plot of the 43rd Mississippi at Cedar Hill Cemetery at Vicksburg. The camel's grave marker is shaped the same as a Confederate veteran and has become a popular visiting and photograph stop. The image has appeared in many newspapers, periodicals, and books like My Camel Regiment. Speaking of Vicksburg being the key to the South, the city uses a key as its logo. I have been told by a prominent Vicksburg citizen that Old Douglas was seriously considered at one time as a city logo. After 47 days of siege warfare, his men starving and unhealthy, and no relief in sight, General Pemberton surrendered the Vicksburg garrison on July 4th. Of old days. The surrender site was near the 3rd Louisiana Redan. The rebels were described as weak and gaunt skeletons, but still proud and dedicated to their cause. They said they were not beaten, but starved out. The 43rd Mississippi, with 531 men, was the second largest regiment surrendered. This number does not include Company H, which was away on detail and cut off from the regiment at Vicksburg. For the Confederate soldiers and citizens of Vicksburg, surrender on the 4th of July was a hard pill to swallow. Talk about unreconstructed. Vicksburg did not celebrate the Federal Independence Day holiday for 80 years. No picnics, fireworks, or day off. After the surrender of Vicksburg, the Federals offered to let all the black population within the city leave with their masters and the Confederate Army as long as it was voluntary. So many of the black population chose to leave, the Yankees became so embarrassed that they rescinded their own policy. A local newspaper reported that 2 servants of the 43rd misled the Yankees into thinking they had been mistreated. Gaining their confidence, the 2 black men were able to confiscate some choice mules and rode off to rejoin the 43rd on their way out of Vicksburg. Captain Merriman Pounds commanded Company H. His company was on duty at Deer Creek, above Vicksburg, at the time the city was surrounded. Cut off from the 43rd, Company H and a few other men from other regiments would be assigned as Pounds Battalion, Mississippi sharpshooters to General Ector's Texas Brigade, General Johnson's Army of Relief. My own great-great-grandfather was a member of Company H. Johnson was ordered to relieve the Confederate Army trapped in Vicksburg. After a few probes, the Union Army turned and chased Johnson and his men into the defenses here at Jackson. Pounds Battalion was stationed northwest of Jackson, close to the Deaf and Dumb Asylum. Now, this is a term no longer used today. The trenches were described as little, insignificant entrenchments not more than a knee deep. Severely pounded by Union artillery, and with the prospect of being caged in, Johnson's army slipped across the Pearl River. Pounds Battalion fought with Ector's Brigade at the Battle of Chickamauga before returning to the regiment stationed at Columbus. The 43rd would be mounted and in the field to halt a Federal raid through the northeast headed to Meridian. They would be soon dismounted and back on foot. Black Confederates and the black population's experience with the Confederate Army is a very intriguing subject. In some instances, their role has been embellished, but it has mostly been ignored or downplayed. What I did throughout the book was to let the soldiers speak for themselves. After all, they were there, they lived it. Anytime the soldiers spoke about the black population connected to the regiment and with the war, I included it. Diaries and letters of the 43rd reveal the loyalty and trust between the servants and the soldiers. Their servants were highly regarded and entrusted to travel back and forth between plantations and the regiment carrying clothing, medicines, foodstuffs, and mail. Many served as cooks and tended to other camp duties. Their servants rode close to the Union lines and could have turned their horses at any time towards the Yankees if they desired. There is even a family story handed down that one soldier of the 43rd was posted alongside a black sharpshooter in a tree. Sharpshooters, or snipers, as referred by today, could be shot on sight if captured. Even in Afghanistan, our snipers today have prices on their head. A federal patrol rode up the same time as these two men were in a tree. At that time, a poisonous viper crawled across both the men's legs. Both remained silent rather than capture. The Yankees unknowingly rode off. Servants were eligible for Confederate pensions. Eli Lampley, who served in the captain's mess and suffered the same hardships and privations throughout most of the war until he became ill, had his application witnessed by Lieutenant Robert Adcock of the 43rd. Adcock would have not done this if he did not believe Lampley did not deserve his pension. The war continued for the bloody 43rd after the fighting in Mississippi. The regiment fought in 14 battles. They were steadfast during 100 days under the fire of the Atlanta campaign, endured the horrific charge at Franklin and the disastrous rout at Nashville. Even after most men realized the war was lost, the 43rd, along what was left of the Army of Tennessee, boarded the dangerous, rickety trains of North Carolina to bloody the nose of a devastating Union Army. At Bentonville, the tattered, worn down, but still proud Army of the Tennessee, waving their Confederate battle flag, shouting their legendary, hair-raising, blood-curdling rebel yell, made one last grand charge. For the men who wore the gray, the war would end shortly afterwards. They walked back to what was left of their homes and rebuilt their lives and communities. Time does not allow me to tell you all about the battles and amazing stories of the regiment. That's what the book's for. This is an opportunity to step back in time and take a journey, a Civil War experience with the bloody 43rd. I have visited every battlefield the 43rd fought at, and now so can you. The Camel Regiment book is available after this program in a signed hard copy, a collectible edition. For those on social media, I invite you to check out, like, and share my Facebook page, the Camel Regiment, 43rd Mississippi, same title as the book. I thank you all for attending, and I hope you have safe travels home or back to work, and I can take some questions or comments. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Your great-grandfather was from Mooresville. Did he survive the war?
He survived the war.
He moved to Texas after the
Yes,
war?
he did.
A lot of Mississippians did.
Mississippi was pretty devastated after the war, and a lot of its population and a lot of the soldiers, moved to Texas. That's correct. He moved to Montgomery County, Texas, which is by Houston. Right. That's exactly what happened.
Thanks. Who was the general or commanding officer for the 3rd? Do you know?
Can you repeat that?
I was asking who was the commanding officer of the 43rd?
The original colonel was William H. Moore. The original colonel was William H. Moore. He's killed at the Battle of Corinth, and then Richard Harrison becomes a colonel.
About how many men served in the 43rd over the course of its entire tenure? Do you know?
Well, it was a large regiment. It made up of 11 companies. Usually a regiment had 10. They had 11. We have about 1,700 names. Now, there might be a few duplicates, a few duplicate names out of this, and many were rejected by a physician when they enlisted. But it was a large regiment. Most of the battles, they were one of the larger ones.
Explain how the 43rd got out of Vicksburg, when they left Vicksburg to go on to Jackson and on that way.
Okay.
Did they have to fight their way out, or?
No, they were surrendered. Okay. Pemberton, General Pemberton, Confederate commander at Vicksburg, surrendered his army. Okay, Grant paroled them. Okay, so that's when, so they were on parole and they were to march as an army to Brandon and then on to the railroads at Enterprise. And so they were on the march. They didn't have any weapons, had to leave their weapons and their flags, unless they snuck out some flags. And so that's where they marched. They were on parole. Okay, they couldn't fight again until they were exchanged. And so when they got exchanged, a Confederate would be exchanged for a captured Union, then they'd be eligible to fight again. So they marched away.
For those black soldiers who fought and stayed in Mississippi, one, were they always just servants, and 2, what happened to them after the war, the ones who stayed in Mississippi? What kind of benefits did they get, if any?
Let me see if I'm understanding. Are you asking about the black Confederates? Or are you asking about the black Confederates? Okay. Well, many of them didn't officially join the Confederate Army. There are some that they have a record of them joining, but many of them went with their master to the Army, and so they were connected in that way. But they were loyal to the Army and loyal. They thought that the South was just their homeland, just like anybody else. When they went to Vicksburg with the 43rd and the rest of the Confederate Army, the Yankees didn't consider them as part of the Confederate Army, but they did. And so, as I mentioned earlier, they were allowed to leave if it was voluntary. They could leave with the Army. Well, so many did that the Federals, embarrassed, rescinded that policy. Okay? So now you're asking what benefits they received? Well, after the war, they were eligible for Confederate pensions. And Mississippi was the first state to really recognize Confederate pensions in 1868. I think that's the year Jeff left. He's an expert on that. And so they were eligible. There was 36,000 Confederate pensioners. 2,000 of them were blacks, okay? And I mentioned Eli Lampley. There were several more in the 43rd that I didn't even realize until after the book was published, okay? In fact, even one of the Confederate pensioners, not with the 43rd, but one of them was a black lady, okay? So they were eligible and they did receive pensions.
You had said that the camels from one group had been set free. I had read where in the Southwest a number of situations where the camels had been sort of objectionable, they had been let free, and that they had formed small herds in that area, and they were believed to maybe persist, except that the Indian population particularly appreciated the flesh.
Okay, yes, they were left to fend for themselves. I think there's reports in the 1930s somebody saw the last camel in Arizona, and it was a descendant of these camels, and that's all true. I've heard that the Indian population pretty much left them alone, but you're saying that they might have ate a few, which is probably true.
Yeah, there was a publication that was associated with the ecology of the Southwest, and they talked about the camels that had been freed, and that they had diminished over a period of time due to the Indians.
Well, that's probably likely.
In a previous program here at the museum, they talked about how women snuck into the armed forces. Did you find any women in the 43rd?
I did not. I did not find any. I did not find any women that were in the Army, but there was plenty of support from women with the regiment as far as sending things to the soldiers, mending socks. Things of that nature. I don't know if we have time, but I'll tell you one really interesting story. Decoration Day, or the forerunner to Memorial Day. One of the ladies, there was 4 ladies who are given credit for starting that in Columbus. One of them is the widow of William Sykes of the regiment, who was killed, and his widow, Augusta. I think it's Augusta. All right, Augustus Sykes, she was one of the founders of it, and her picture of her with the 4 ladies is at the museum here. It's either at the old thing. So there was lots of contributions by the ladies, but I didn't find any actually, picking up a rifle, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. Sir?
Let's do the microphone. I'll bring
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Back to the pensions that were paid, who paid it? Was that through federal funds?
State of Mississippi. The federal government gave nothing to Confederates. Okay? Now, later on, they did, but no, it was the states that had to do that.
So it was after World War II that Vicksburg started celebrating July the 4th.
That's correct. Now, that doesn't mean that Vicksburg wasn't patriotic and sent some of its best people to our services, and it doesn't mean that, but just as a city, they did not, they still stuck in their craw a little bit.
I'm from Vicksburg. You belatedly said just as a city. A lot of people did not observe U.S. Independence Day, but a lot of people in Warren County did, because Grant had a whole lot of supporters, and we would celebrate the 4th of July every year.
Have you heard that story about Vicksburg, what I just related?
Yes.
Okay, all right,
And I know about Douglas. and all that.
okay, all right,
Good story.
all right.
Any other questions? Do you want to say a word about where you'll be this weekend?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Well, if you haven't got enough Camel Regiment, okay, I'm going to be in Oxford at the Phillips Grocery. That's a restaurant, and there's a man, Stark Miller. He does Miller Civil War tours of that area, and we're going to be together. And there's another historian that did a book on the 15th Mississippi, which was brigaded with the 43rd, and that starts at 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. So anybody is welcome to come by. You can have lunch and just get more Civil War history. Then later that night, I'm going to be in Ripley at the VFW. They want more Camel Regiment there, so that's at 7 o'clock in Ripley. It's a Chippewa Tigers is hosting that. Then, I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but Saturday and Sunday, there's a Civil War show in Brandon. And it's at the City Hall, or no, Civic Center. It's in, there's going to be authors besides myself there. There's going to be vendors of lots of different types of merchandise. There's going to be living history, period music, all kinds of artifacts to see and touch. It's a really good event to bring your family. And that's Saturday and Sunday. So hope you all take advantage of that. It's right in your neck of the woods.
We have copies of the Camel Regiment for sale here. Scott will be glad to sign them. Thank you all for coming. I hope that we see you back here next Wednesday for Schneck, Garrett, Scott. Help me thank Scott Bell for this program today.
Thank you.